Hello. Bom dia a todos e todas. Good morning, everyone. I'm shifting to English so that we can hold our conversation in English in this panel. So it's a pleasure today to be here with all of you in another roundtable of our series of roundtables that compete, the Competition, Public Policy, Innovation, and Technology Research Group at FGV. And today we're here to discuss a very important topic, the relationship between competition and sustainability. This is currently a hot topic, as all of you have been following. Actually very hot, as government and private parties take several initiatives to deal with sustainability goals, and there is a coordinated effort to tackle climate change all over the world. So some of these initiatives that are being taken by companies and governments raise issues that are very connected with competition, and that's what we're going to be dealing with today. So, for example, cooperation among firms to achieve sustainability goals may impact competition directly. Also, many public policies adopted by different countries and different governments may impact the playing field of firms competing in different markets. And yet a third example, the energy transition to a green economy will certainly lead to deep reconfiguration of several markets. So think about energy markets, civil aviation, automobiles. All these markets are being changed very profoundly with the energy transition. So these will all impact competition as well. In this context, it's particularly important to understand the interfaces between sustainability and competition policy, and that's going to be our subject today. To discuss this topic, we have a stellar set of panelists joining us from around the globe. So first, let me introduce the panelists here. Elizabeth Farina is a senior professor at the School of Economics at the University of São Paulo. Among many positions, Elizabeth was the president of CADE, the Brazilian Competition Authority. She was also the president of UNICA, the Association of the Sugar and Ethanol Industry in Brazil. And more recently, she was the executive director of the Road Resources Institute in Brazil, WRI. She's certainly one of the most prominent economists with experience in both competition policy and sustainability in Brazil, and known worldwide. Joining us from Sweden, we have Julian Novak, associate professor and senior lecturer at Lund University in Sweden, where he directs a master in European business law. He holds a master's and a doctorate from Oxford University, where he also teaches sometimes. And Julian published a book titled Environmental Integration, Competition in Free Movements Law. And he's also the author of the OECD Background Note on Sustainability and Competition from 2020. So he's certainly one of the foremost experts in the subject, and he's been pushing this in Europe very strongly. Thank you so much for joining us, Julian. It's a pleasure to have you here as well. Then we have Marcela Lorenzetti here from FGV. She's a graduate from the Catholic University, and she's currently a candidate in FGV's master program in law and development, where she's focusing her work on competition law and sustainability. So it's great to have you here, Marcela. Thank you for joining as well. Last but not least, joining from Indonesia, and here we have a truly global panel today. We have Pablo Jimenez Machado. Pablo is the executive director at Suzano, which is the largest pulp producer in the world. He's a graduate from the Catholic University São Paulo, holding an LLM from University of California, Davis. And Pablo has been a leading figure in sustainability discussions, not only in Suzano, but in the business community more broadly, both in Brazil and around the world. Pablo is participating in many of the fora where key issues are being discussed on sustainability, and he's been a leader in these discussions. So it's really a true pleasure to have all of you here to discuss this very important topic of sustainability and competition policy. Before we start, just a short disclaimer from FGV. All statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. To continue with this transmission, we ask you to express your agreement by verbalizing or signaling your agreement with this recording. So thank you very much for agreeing to participate here. So let's get the ball rolling in our conversation here. And I think to kick off the conversation, I'd like to invite Julian and then Marcela afterwards to give us a bit of the background of this discussion and how you see the relationships between sustainability and competition policy and the challenges ahead of us. So maybe, Julian, you could kick off the conversation. I think you've been kicking off this conversation since at least 2020, where you did that for OECD and all countries related there. So thank you so much for joining us.
That was the wrong button. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure, and it's a shame that we are not like meeting all together in one place, but I hope we can do that at some point. And it's a great pleasure to be at FGV. Thank you for having me. So I'll try to give you a bit of a background, and a bit of the development and how to think about these things. So I always want to start with a bit of a disclaimer. I think we will all agree, even if we are of different opinions on panels sometimes, we all agree that ideally we want to have regulation dealing with sustainability matters and regulating the world in a more sustainable way. But that is not always possible, and it does not always happen. So we're essentially living in a world of second best. And in this world of second best, what are we talking about? And I'll give you an example of why this debate matters. And that is an example from, I think, last year, where the attorney generals of a couple of states in the United States have started antitrust enforcement proceedings against the Net Zero Climate Alliance. Those are essentially financial managers who have all committed to trying to foster the net zero emissions pledge. This is part of this pledge comes out of the, I think it was COP25 or 26, I don't know, I don't remember exactly, but basically it was the UN framework, and those managers were all there, and they said, like, well, we need to do something to achieve net zero, and we want to be part of this. So that's the kind of background, and these attorney generals, from the United States, in particular from the oil-producing countries, states have brought a prosecution there because they thought it was very objectionable from an antitrust point of view that they committed to this zero emissions pledge. Okay, and then the next part is I wanted to quickly tell you, like Kayo has already said, I've been working on this for quite some time. When I started to work on this, that was in 2008. I came up with this idea. Back then, it was still called kind of environmental protection and sustainability. And whenever I went to a conference and I said what I'm doing, people said like, oh, so you're studying how, and that's also something maybe we're going to discuss, how government regulation affects competition, how environmental regulation affects competition. I said, no, that's not what I'm doing. I'm looking how this turns out and plays out in competition. And how does that play out? That I've developed back then, and I've tried to adapt that framework a bit to the sustainability debate, which then came up. I think I was first involved in 2018. I talked to my old supervisor, and he said, Julian, now everyone is talking about like sustainability is coming up. Maybe you should get involved in this. Even though I was like so happy in 2017, the book came out. I had finished a PhD in 2014. I was actually happy that I didn't have to deal with this anymore. But then by 2018, I was back in the midst of it. And since then, I'm like dipping my toes here and there in whenever I have the chance to. So, and I wanted to give you a bit of, that was the broad background, but I think the most important thing if you're having a discussion is to have some kind of framework. And I think the framework that I'm going to try to present to you is a bit helpful in the sense that it helps us identify where we are in common, or where we have things in common, and where we are having some issues and some debate. So in general, I think it makes sense to distinguish two things in terms of competition law. So one is what my colleague Simon Holmes called the sword, and which might be better be called a kind of pro-enforcement competition law, where you're trying to attack activities that are unsustainable using competition law. That can be abuses of dominance that are having particular effects on poor people, or things like that. So you're using competition law as a sword. Might also be cases of anti-sustainability cartels. There's a case in Europe concerning the emissions from cars, where the car producers had agreed not to compete on getting better emission technology out there. There's the AdBlue case. So that's one thing. You're trying to use competition law to attack unsustainable business practice. And then the second part, and that's, I think, where the majority of debate these days happens, or maybe we have already moved on in Europe from that, is the shield situation. So there you're having a company that is trying, or companies that are trying to do something. Pablo might be telling us a bit more about this. They're trying to do something to become more sustainable alone or together. And then you might be thinking, okay, so can they argue that this provides benefits in terms of CO2 reductions, or in other terms of elements of sustainable development? And that's another question. So those are the kind of two things, sword and shield. And then we can always, depending on which jurisdiction we are, but I think it also helps to think about what is actually within the scope of competition law, and when is within the scope of competition law, then how do we create a balance? Because I think what we sometimes forget is that not every restriction on economic freedom then is a restriction of competition, because not every contract is a restriction of competition, but every contract restricts economic freedom in a certain way. So I think it helps to think about scope, what is within the scope, and what is, if something is within the scope, how do we balance these things? And that's the kind of general thing. And I think those are the things that I've been working on for quite some time. But Kai also mentioned something else, and I wanted to highlight that. And I think it's going to come up in this panel as well. And that's something I haven't worked so much about on it. That's government action. That's regulation. That's maybe other government initiatives, handing out money to businesses and so on to achieve more sustainable outcomes. It's not something that I've been doing too much work on, but I stumble across that from time to time. So I think that sets a bit kind of the scene, and we can have a chat and see where we disagree and where we agree. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julian. I think this is very helpful, and it's a good way of seeing the different roles that competition policy can play in this sphere. Marcela, would you like to complement that and give us a bit of the background as well?
Thank you, Caio. Thank you, Julian. Especially thank you, Julian, because your kicking off in the discussion is what allowed me to pursue my master's degree in this subject. So thank you very much. I'd like to talk about a little bit about the Brazilian perspective, and I would say up front that I have more questions than answers about these matters, and about which role competition authorities should have in sustainability matters, but I can share some thoughts. As we know, the discussion in Brazil is a little far behind than from Europe, for example, and we know CADE has a resistance on matters like this, alleging lack of mandate, not only on sustainability matters, but any matter that deviate from the traditional consumer welfare standards. However, I don't necessarily think that we need to completely change the framework of competition defense. I think maybe simply changing how we think about this framework and considering a different perspective may be enough, because there's at least part of sustainability aspects that are objective and can be measured economically. So CADE would do the same analysis as it does today, today, only considering different variables and different data. I also believe that part of the problem is that the discussion in Brazil right now is only theoretical. We haven't had any specific cases to discuss, but I believe this is unavoidable. Soon these cases will come knocking on CADE's doors, and then the authority will have to make a decision about how to approach them. And I highlight here some very simple examples, but just it's easy to imagine how such cases would go considering what are CADE's main roles. So, for example, regarding agreements between competitors, we could see an agreement between firms to discontinue a product that is particularly harmful to the environment, like single-use plastic. That could be a way that competition and the environment match in these discussions. In terms of unilateral conducts, we could imagine a dominant firm establishing green requirements for its commercial partners, which in turn may raise barriers to entry in that said market that the firm acts. In mergers, it's possible to take into account those objective economic aspects I mentioned of environmental costs or efficiencies. And I think the simplest may be CADE's advocacy role, where their authority could provide guidance on how certain environmental requirements may hinder or favor competition between players in a public bid. The first example I gave, agreements between competitors, maybe where we have more of a difficult situation, because we have a per se prohibition under competition law in Brazil, meaning that any agreement between competitors that restrict competition is considered a violation. So this is where the discussion mainly focused, because if CADE was to allow that agreement, for example, to eliminate single-use plastic, it would most likely have to change their approach to agreements between competitors, as not all agreements that would restrict competition be considered a violation as it is today. So this has been mainly the focus on literature, I believe. The other situations I mentioned, meaning merger control, advocacy role, or unilateral conducts, I don't see how they would demand a change from CADE's current action plan, let's say. They don't demand a complete overhaul of how CADE currently works, but simply a shift in its focus. So I think there is room to accommodate these discussions. Specifically regarding merger review, I think it may be a little bit different, because like I mentioned, the discussion so far has been very much focused on agreements between competitors, but there can be a different impact on merger cases depending on how they go. So let's imagine, for example, two situations. One is a case with a high market concentration, but several environmental efficiencies that can be economically measured. So CADE wouldn't need to change his tool of analysis. This case could be approved and would mean a lower degree of intervention. On the other hand, we could have a case with low market shares, but significant damages to the environment, again, that can be measured economically. If this deal is blocked, it would mean a higher degree of intervention. So one of the questions I have is, when we ask if competition authorities should look at sustainability, are we prepared to give the same answers to both of these cases that I just mentioned as an example? They have the same base situation, meaning environmental dimensions being considered in the merger review projects, but the result is different, including on how it may impact the objective of competition defense. Are we looking for a more or less active authority? So we may have a bit of a collision route here. And what I'm doing here, I'm just mentioning some very exaggerated simplification of possible interfaces between these both two subjects. And my point is just to illustrate where competition may meet sustainability efforts. What I gather from these reflections is that competition authorities claiming a lack of mandates just out of hand may not be completely accurate, at least in some situations. This is why I believe a refusal, like we tend to see here in Brazil, a denial of a refusal to acknowledge possible common ground without at least discussing how competition and sustainability may interact is misplaced. I believe at least in some cases, it's very much possible to accommodate sustainability discussions within competition law. We just need to analyze a different set of data. Of course, there are other cases like agreements between competitors or major review that can be more complex. And authorities, of course, would have the possibility of establishing limits on how sustainability overlaps with competition law. But claiming that these two subjects are completely separate and never overlap can be a little bit, in my opinion, short-sighted, maybe. So to conclude all that I've said, I don't necessarily argue that the answer is yes, CAD should always look at sustainability and always favor it. I think the answer could be, it depends, or only sometimes. But my point is that this is a nuanced matter that could use some guidelines, and we can only achieve these guidelines if authorities are willing to come to the table and be part of the discussion.
Thank you, Marcela. I think these are very interesting examples, and they show a bit of the tension between some of the potential enforcement activity and sustainability issues as well. I agree that CADE hasn't been really tackling the issue directly, although indirectly it has appeared in a few cases like joint ventures or associations in industries that are dealing with reverse logistics regarding waste, for instance, right? So there is some cooperation among competitors that will get together to reduce waste in a particular industry. Of course, they could compete for that. They could each one develop its own logistics to deal with that. But CADE has accepted that it may be more efficient and beneficial to do that, although this hasn't been really tackling a direct agreement that would, for instance, in your example, increase prices if they shift from plastic to another material, for instance, right? So I think these are challenges ahead, but I don't think it's completely out of the scope of what some of the issues that CADE has started to approach. Let's see how it's going to develop, but I fully agree that to a certain extent, CADE is still refusing to engage in a conversation in a way that I think other authorities are engaging at this point. But that's just a very brief reaction here. I'm not sure, Pablo or Elizabeth, if you'd like to have any quick reaction here on Julian and Marcela, please feel free to jump in.
May I?
Sure.
Okay. So just some words that I would like to bring to our conversation is very much economics rationale on these issues. And I would like to bring to our context market forces. So for the economists, from the economics inputs associated with sustainability or competition law, I think that we have to remember that the main thing we have in our heads is that market forces allow us to reach economic efficiency. So what we're looking for, economic efficiency, but under very restricted assumptions, such as unbounded rationality. So people has the best of the information, and we can take decisions based on rational acts. But if market failures are present, so there is bounded rationality, we say that if they are present, the market forces will not deliver the desirable results. And if we live in a world of bounded rationality, regulators may be a space to act. So what I'm saying is that I would like to remind us that yes, we have, if we have market failures, we don't have the best of the allocation of our resources, okay? So what I will bring ahead is which kind of failures we are dealing when we discuss sustainability, which kind of market failures we are talking about when we talk in these different situations, which kind of market failure demands some intervention or not. Okay, just an opening remark, let's say.
If I may just give maybe a little bit of a different background and a different view to this. I must say first, I want to thank you, Caio, and compliment FGV for organizing this great session. It's the first time I discuss the interactions among competition and sustainability. And I think this is very exciting. I would just like to drop maybe one or two ideas here, more on the business side. So needless to say that climate change is one of the major challenges of the society today, and that really requires urgent actions at scale, including from the businesses across the world. And when we're talking about actions towards a greener or a transition to low carbon economy and all that, we are talking about actions of impact. In order for us to achieve impact and to ensure that the climate targets might be achieved, there is a key concept, which is collaboration. And collaboration means acting together, acting in concert. The more you can create frameworks that will bring people together to work towards the same direction, the higher is the likelihood of achieving most significant impacts. So, and when it comes to collaboration, then competition comes into play, because then we need to start thinking a little bit further on, okay, collaboration appears to be a key factor to this, but we should also take into account that collaboration has boundaries. Otherwise, collaborations might dysfunction the market. So this is one important concept I would like to bring to this, which is how to manage and how to create boundaries to collaborations, which on one hand will not violate competition law. On the other hand, also boundaries that will not limit the capability of businesses across the world to create beneficial impacts to the society. The second one that I would like to bring is what the business community needs to do now is to accelerate innovation. Without innovation, what needs to get done is impossible. The massive investments towards the transition of an energy matrix, just to keep one of the examples that you raised earlier, Kyle, that requires not only investments on existing technology, that also involves speeding up the go-to-market at scale of new technologies. And innovation can only be fostered on a market that functions. So if we have dysfunctions on competition, it creates an environment where it's more unlikely that companies will speed up their innovation processes. And on that, competition has a pretty important role to play, because if companies do not have a free and competing market, they tend to invest less in innovation. They tend to invest less in research and development, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to the business aspect and their intertwinedness with competition and sustainability, I think those two different concepts, collaboration and innovation, are key factors, and thinking on how competition law, competition authorities, and competition policies can foster sustainability. I think this is really an excellent role that competition can play into supporting what the society and business community needs to do.
Thank you very much, Pablo and Elizabeth. I think these are all very interesting inputs. I think the concerns with better functioning markets, right, and dealing with market failures regarding sustainability, and also information failures, I think it's one of the points raised here, and also the issues on cooperation and innovation. I think they're all key for these discussions, and there are certainly issues that are in the core of the discussions of competition authorities. I mean, these are not issues that are on the fringes, right? I mean, these are issues in the core of the agenda. And let me just mention one headline of today in Brazil here, so that we can debate a bit on this discussion on cooperation that you're raising and innovation, right? So there is this headline saying that FEBRABAN, the Association of the Banks, are moving to a cooperation among the banks to avoid giving credit to those meat companies that are producing meat in Brazil, that are fostering or buying meat from people in the Amazon, right? So that it's creating deforestation. So it's reducing credit for meat packers. This is potentially, and it's not entirely clear from the headlines and from the news this morning, but it's potentially a coordination to reduce credit for a particular piece of the market if they go into deforestation, right? So it's clearly a sustainability goal. And by the way, this is illegal, right? Just to raise a cattle in the middle of the Amazon. I mean, there are lots of regulations for this. So they're really applying legal standards in evaluating credit. I think this is part of the type of collaborations that we can see more and more happening. And it's a collaboration around a standard, a legal standard that was established by the government already. So it's not a collaboration that's in the void about, okay, let's create a movement, for instance, in the example of Marcela, saying, let's not produce plastic for single use, right? There is a standard, there's a legal standard, and banks are just saying, look, we're going to enforce this privately, right? We're going to say we're not going to give credit in this. So how do you see these types of initiatives in a context of competition policy as well? do these raise any concerns? Where the concern starts? Is it when companies are setting a new standard, like the one that Marcelo was proposing for plastic, for instance, or any other one? They could say, well, we're not going to have any cars with fossil fuel anymore tomorrow. Would this be something that would raise competition concerns? So just to try to have a few reactions here. I'm not sure, Julian, Marcela, if you'd like to jump in here after Pablo's and Elizabeth's comments as well.
Yes, I can jump in, and I actually find it interesting to hear about that case. It reminds me, I think there was previously a case in Brazil that also concerned deforestation. I forgot whether it was also cattle or it was soy, but there was also a kind of producers that said buyers that said we're not gonna buy from deforested land, and there was a threat to bring the case to CAGI, and then that agreement or that cooperation was stopped. So it's not something new, but it's interesting to see that now from the banks. So how should we think about this? I think it is worth to start thinking about it a bit from a critical perspective. I think when there's the old saying from Adam Smith, when businessmen get together, then you need to be really kind of careful. So I think that's always a good starting point. But I think Pablo rightly said we might need some kind of activity if we want to move quickly and we want to address this market failure with some people have said the biggest market failure of all, climate change and achieving the climate targets. Then we might need to address that market failure somehow. So the question is, how do we deal with this? And I think the answer should not be a simple yes or no. It should be, as Marcela rightly said, it should be, it depends. And I think we can then think about on what it depends. And an agency, I think, should have an engagement with situations like this and should talk with companies that do want to move forward in a cooperation manner, and think about it in a strategic way. It's like kind of advising them into how things can be done and cannot be done. And I think in particular in Brazil, if I hear now that you have this kind of per se standard, that advice might be particularly helpful. I can give you another example that comes from Europe and is then also related to more or less deforestation and sustainability. It's the Madagascar vanilla pledge. It's buyers of the biggest buyers of vanilla, I think Nestle and so on, were also part of it. And they said, we're not going to buy vanilla from Madagascar that comes from farms that use slave labor and that are not paying the minimum standard and are not complying essentially with the local laws. And the interesting question was what the advice that was given to this companies, and it was, I think, 2018, was that the European Commission will not really be involved in that case. Why? Because the effect on the market is not going to be massive. The consumers are going to just have a very tiny increase in price, a couple of cents for the vanilla, because vanilla is not the main ingredient. So it's a de minimis and it's not restricting even a competition. So I think those questions we need to think and through, and there I think advice, advocacy, reaching out to the business community and talking with them is important.
Thank you. Marcela?
I think there are two, this is a very interesting case, and I think there are two dimensions to what you described here. First, focusing on the idea that this is a environmental regulation that we have, and on one hand, we have players that are not observing such regulations. There have been cases where companies have tried to argue competitive violations due to not following other type of regulations, and CADE has already refuted this thesis, I think, involving tax matters. So on one hand, I don't think these players would be prosecuted by CADE. the ones that are illegally raising cattle in the Amazon. So that's where it enters the idea that you mentioned, the banks are gonna privately enforce this. I think it's the expression you used. And I think my initial reaction when you said it, we described the case was, I think CADE may have a problem with that agreement, with that idea. But then I remember there was a case involving Abiotica in the optical market, involving a seal of approval, a seal of quality, and CADE shelved the case, understanding there was a lack of a violation. So it can be a way that it's not exactly the same case, but it can be similar. It's just that there's a specific set of criteria that players have to meet to be part of this group to play with the banks, let's say. And if they are based on regulations and actual increase in quality or performance or safety, like was the case with Abiotica, I think maybe there are good arguments to say this agreement does not raise competition concerns, like CADE has previously decided. So I don't know. I see both both sides to this.
If I may jump in, I would like to share. Yeah, I would like to share with you a international market practice that might be interesting discussing a little bit. So I think it's difficult for anyone to sustain, okay, we shouldn't create any restriction to someone using slaves to grow cattle. That is even intuitively wrong. Nobody should be doing that, and we should not support that. The thing becomes more interesting when we start talking about private frameworks. We're not talking about regulation, but rather private frameworks that establish a certain set of rules that businesses should follow in order to get, for instance, a sustainable certification. And this type of scheme already exists in multiple different industries, including in the industry where I'm in, which is the bio-based industry. So this is an international set of rules that says you cannot deforest, more or less obvious, but you cannot use, for instance, this type of agrochemical or this type of fertilizer. If you do not get the certification. But then the impact of not getting the certification is, in practice, big retailers in developed countries are not going to buy from us. So to which extent this type of private schemes that already exist in the market create dysfunctions that might affect competition?
I think that's a great question, Pablo, and I do think we need more guidance on this. I think that's part of Julian's point, right? And saying, look, this not only already exists, but it's likely that's going to be even deeper and more widespread in the near future, and not less, right? So types of certification, types of alliances, like the one described on vanilla, but I mean, in Brazil, I know that we have a couple as well, like trying to deal with particular biomas to be protected, like the Amazon or Cerrado. There are some initiatives trying to protect those biomas. So these are really, I think, the key issues for the future. I mean, it's guidance on the extent of cooperation that can happen. And even cooperation, in the sense that Julian just mentioned, cooperation that may have some impact. And the minimus position of the European Union say, look, if this impact is a few cents, it's fine. But if the impact is like €2, is that not fine? I mean, where's the limit of this, right? So they couldn't really deny buying from farms that use slavery if the impact was €2 and not 2 cents. I mean, I think this type of guidance, where the limits are drawn and what types of impacts are happening, because it sounds like, Julian, as you're describing that, look, even if you keep with the consumer welfare standard, right, consumers not really being hurt with this particular initiative. But I think the big issues that are raised, and that's part of what I think Pablo's question raises as well, is, let's face it, sometimes there's going to be a tension with the consumer welfare, right? Like, if you want to be more sustainable, if you want to move to a road where we really deeply care about climate change and about other issues, maybe some prices are going to have to increase, and we're going to have to deal with that. So I think that's where the tensions get more complicated, and that's where we need further guidance, and potentially we need a scheme and a way of thinking that we can at least try to balance how much consumer welfare we're willing to forgo for certain benefits that are really, I mean, could be factored in a broader sense of consumer welfare, right? Like of citizenship welfare, if you will. That I think it's something that's on the table as well. So I think that's the type of question that I think are being raised in some jurisdictions. And I wonder, Julian, and going back to you on your example on the vanilla, if there's further guidance about these tensions where really you can sacrifice some consumer welfare for another goal, or not, or still in this uncharted territory that we have to cross this bridge when we get there, and we have the few cases that meet that.
May I jump?
Yeah, I was provoking Julian as well,
yeah.
So please jump back.
Oh,
and
I'm
then,
sorry.
And Julian, go. No, go ahead, please.
Okay, so we are talking about at least 3 market failures. And one is about information. If you have imperfect or incomplete or asymmetric information, that makes the life of organizations such as the regulators. Regulators are in fact organizations, so that are acting, but with unbounded rationality. We are talking about market power. Okay, so this is a classical market failure. And in the last years, 4 or 5 years, there is the idea that we had a lot of increase in concentration, and concentration is one of the problems that can raise market power. We have to discuss this because this is not a simple discussion. We need evidence, empirical evidence, and this is quite interesting and challenging for the regulators. And in the end, we have these externalities that explain how we will see, will you see what happens if you leave only for market forces the role to respond to climate changes, to climate challenges, and not only climate, but other issues such as slavery. And yes, so we have to, at some time, to improve the results of an intervention when you have externalities, positive or negative. And I like to see the externalities being considered as unpriced goods. So when we have unpriced goods, we have a problem that you can overinvest in something that has a higher cost private or a lower cost if you compare to social costs. So private costs will be lower, and we will invest more in something that you don't want to increase to have a growth. Okay, and you have to produce this price. So you can, of course, use tax. You can use the ETS. You can use other creation of prices in order to correct this externality that has that will create barriers to improve the market failures. And just to organize my here, yes, we have had, if we don't have market forces coming, we can say that market forces alone cannot save us from the horrible future with high investments in this kind of products. So market forces alone cannot save us because of market failures. Regulation alone cannot save us because we have government failures, such as too much intervention. And innovation may save us, but we cannot just bet on that. So I would say the issue is complex. I like it so much, this discussion, because I think one of the best discussions I have participated about this interface, because I can feel an analytical body of thinking that helps to understand the limits, but the needs of intervention in one side or lower intervention the other side. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to participate and listen to this discussion. Thank you.
Sure, Beth. Thank you very much. And I think these are, I mean, how to deal with these market failures, internalize these externalities. This is part of some of what some private parties are trying to do on their own, right? I mean, we're not talking about the vanilla market. When we're talking about the banks in Brazil, I mean, they're facing some externalities and they're saying, look, this market needs to correct these externalities, and the same one way of correcting it is not buying from those that are creating these externalities, right? And let's buy from those that are not creating it. And I think these private schemes raise, as Pablo mentioned, particularly interesting concerns and interesting discussions in trying to set where are these limits, as Beth is putting. And so let me jump back to Europe here, Julian, and see if we have some signals of where these limits are at this point, and then we can move to a different topic briefly on conduct enforcement, if we will. So let's move along these lines.
Yes, so I think like it's an interesting question, the kind of balancing you had that how much are we paying? So we haven't seen too much on slave labor, and I think that the interesting thing is, in a certain way, it's an interesting topic to talk about, because we can all agree that that's certainly something that we cannot, and the competition authority cannot like enforce a law that leads to more slave labor. But we are not seeing too much about it. What we have seen in Europe is quite some work. The Dutch have something. The UK has also something on climate change agreements, and there they try to use different measurements economic measurements to balance restrictions, price rises against climate benefits. So that's one thing. And there, I think it goes back to what Marcella said, like using different forms to different variables, I think you said, to measure impacts. And I think it's there again, not an either or, and it goes back to what Elizabeth was talking about, and Pablo as well. It's the innovation part. So I think what I always say is you have this kind of Venn diagram where you can like have on the one side sustainability, and the other side you can have competition, and they can overlap. And the question is, to what extent do they overlap? Certain elements where they overlap, we can measure in classical consumer welfare terms and say innovation, sustainable innovation, we can use the classical tools. And then we can push this out and say what Marcella has said, and we can try to use different variables. And that's what the Dutch and UK competition authority are saying we're going to do for climate change. Whether we do that for slave labor, we don't know. At least we haven't seen anyone, but I still would like to see the competition authority that brings a case that leads to more slave labor. So I don't think that that's going to happen. But I think we are coming then here to something that Elizabeth was just talking about, and you as well mentioned, Kayo. I think it's an interesting point when the banks say, we don't want to give you guys the money to do something bad with it. We don't want to buy from you. And in a certain way, it's something that is also related to the heart of private law, the freedom of contract, right? I should be able to say, well, I don't want to use my money in a way that it supports people being enslaved, that it supports the Amazon being cut down, or something else that I don't like. And companies should somehow react to that. The question is how you do it. And I think what we have also slightly touched upon with Pablo is these international norms. And I think standards is something where we can talk much more about. And we have actually done a lot of work in standards in previous years. And we haven't talked so much in this debate about standards and standard setting. We have seen them in the technology area and whatever, but we also know that there are lots of private safety standards out there. And we also know that there are competition authorities have rarely engaged in that. Maybe if there was something, some kind of ambush in the standard where someone has abused that standard to take out competitors in some kind of very strange ways, then we have seen engagement with those. But in general, you don't see much interaction. So those are just my comments, and then we can see.
Thank you very much, Julian. I think that's very, very interesting, and see how we can evolve in these standards discussion. I think it's one particular field that's very promising, and I agree with you that this could be some kind of like co-regulation where standards could be established in private parties, but also enforced by governments. So we could have some back and forth in this here. Of course, the big questions about freedom of contract in these areas is really about when nobody's willing to take this decision individually, right? Where you need a collective decision to make that viable at all. So I think that's where the challenge is, and we need to face that. So before we move forward, we're receiving a few questions, and I should just remark that anyone that's watching through YouTube can send questions through Slido. So it's just a link below the YouTube video. You can just click the link and send a question. But let me take one of the questions that we received here and see your reactions, and then we can go back to a couple other issues. But one of them is about intergenerational effects, right? So it says how to measure intergenerational effects within a consumer welfare perspective, if we're still using a consumer welfare perspective, when we barely manage to evaluate price effects at all. So if we have difficulties in applying consumer welfare standards to very simple price effects discussions, how are we going to do that with environmental discussions where we need to take into account intergenerational effects, so that whatever we do today is actually affecting other generations that are not here to be directly considered. So I think that's a big question for competition authorities, both on purely economic grounds, but also on the policy ground, on how to think about these issues in a way that makes sense and that can maybe integrate a bit of these tensions between what we're calling consumer welfare in a very static manner of impact on prices today against the externalities that Elizabeth was commenting that's always involved here, right? So do we have a framework for that, or we don't yet? I think that's the question that we got from the audience here. And do we need it? I think those are the two questions that I would extract from this one.
Caio, I think this is one kind of market failure as well. So who will pay today if I value more what is in 30 years or 20 years from now? It's not, there is a bias of pricing, and we have to address this discussion on pricing such as a market failure. So I can adopt a public policy which will not approve that I will leave to my grandchildren the investment needs when they need. Okay, today I am okay. I will not put my money here because I will not be happy with put my money in something more urgent because I am older or because I am younger. So the logic, I think the rationale could be more or less the same. Yes, we have to take care of not opening a door of too much intervention in this regard.
If I may, I think
Please,
I think this is a very difficult discussion, economically speaking, $1 today is worth way more than $1 30 years from now. So it's very difficult to think that the market will self-regulate itself to tackle this issue. So I think that then governments and regulators, they play a key role in trying to find this balance, and the society also plays a key role in putting pressure around that, and also trying to select based on their consumer behavior. One thing that happens today and is a business problem for a lot of companies is okay, should we put a price to carbon? I mean, an internal price to carbon. We're not forced to do it. There's no regulation imposing that to us. But is this the right thing to do? And if we do so, what is the impact to our cost? What is the impact to our investment? And will that create any impact in terms of how we market our products? And can we balance the two? So I think this type of discussions are already on the table of boards and management across the globe. And we will certainly need more clarity from regulators and lawmakers about that. And so far, I am unfortunately not too optimistic that business leaders will by themselves sort out or address this issue as fast as the problem requires.
I think that's a very, very important point, Pablo, and this issue of pricing carbon within the decisions of companies, and whether that's possible to do at all individually, right, unilaterally, without some kind of cooperation in different markets. Otherwise, we're going to have companies seeing costs and taking decisions in different ways, depending on how they price carbon, how they include that in their production chain. And I think that's one of the challenges as well. And another challenge, and we see that sometimes in passing this through to consumers in the end, right? So if you think about civil aviation, and you think about some carriers today are giving you the opportunity to actually neutralize your carbon footprint, right? So when you buy your ticket on an airplane, you can say, I'm going to pay a bit more to actually either fund partially the green fuel or neutralize the carbon footprint. Imagine that some of these carriers just decide to say, look, it's not an option anymore. I'm going to charge more because I made a decision that this is part of my cost, right? Just as you were saying, they're taking the position that it's not only about buying the fuel, it's about neutralizing the carbon footprint of the whole carrier. It seems very difficult for a carrier to do that unilaterally alone, right? I mean, it's suddenly is going to have prices that are higher than everybody else. And they're going to have difficulties in dealing, in selling their product. They may even go bankrupt at some point. So I think these are the challenges that they're putting, Pablo, and maybe we need governments in part of this in tackling these challenges. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get there and to actually influence, for instance, innovation in green fuel for civil aviation, for instance. I mean, that's a huge step of innovation that we should be focusing more, for instance. But let me get back to one of Julian's image in the beginning of this discussion and maybe move forward in a new direction. That is the sword here, Julian. When we think about enforcement, right, and especially on the conduct level, on looking at how companies behave, how do you see the sword moving? I mean, where the enforcement's moving that could actually deal with environmental issues and sustainability issues? So what have you seen so far, and where could we go with the sword? How far can the sword go in helping here? So that would be my question to you, if you could entertain that for a bit.
Well, it's a very difficult question, and I can give you a very easy answer. The sword can go as far as you want it to go. What do I mean by this? Whether it makes sense, that is always a different question, but it can go very far. So the easy cases, I say, are there was one in France, for example, where they agreed not to compete on the environmental performance of floor tiles, hardwood floor. They said, we're not going to inform the consumers about our environmental performance. We're just not going to tell that to consumers. I think that's a rather easy case, and say like, well, this is anti-competitive. You are preventing competition here on the environmental aspects. That's an easy one. It gets more tricky once we are talking about innovation. That's the case that I mentioned before on the AdBlue, where they basically said, we're not going to further develop this AdBlue technology that helps us in filtering the diesel emissions from diesel cars. So there, I think it's a bit trickier for competition authorities to get involved, because innovation is difficult. And that links in part back to the intergenerational question that you mentioned from the panel. I just wanted to quickly say something about that. And I think we do see some intergenerational considerations also already in standard competition law, which is the question of innovation. It's not always easy, but we do see that. Other frameworks in terms of intergenerational ones are outside the traditional consumer framework, welfare framework. In environmental economics, you find them shadow pricing. The Dutch competition authority says they're going to use prices that have been set by another part of the government. They are using a certain price model to calculate costs relating to CO2 emissions and save CO2 emissions, so they can rely on that. But coming back to your questions, to the sword, and then it gets more tricky. If we are moving beyond innovation, we are then maybe talking about trying to go about and say, like, well, this is an abusive business practice because you are not paying enough money for farmers or so on. And I think that's essentially exploitative abuses. Some countries have that, others don't. And others are, even if they have them, they're a bit more reluctant to use them, while other competition agencies around the world might be a bit more aggressive in that regard. So I think there is ways, but I think it gets more dangerous or more tricky, let's put it that way, the more you push out the sword and the more you use it. But I think overall, we have seen more discussion on the sword in the last year now. The commission with the CO2 case was, I think, the first one, and we see more debate about this area and what can be done.
Thank you. I think this is very helpful, and I think also reminds us that maybe a lot can be done, but not too much, right? I mean, we can't really attribute to competition authorities the role of enforcing environmental rules overall. I mean, competition authorities have limit on using this word. They possibly can do more, but they have limits. I think that's part of what I read from what you were saying here as well. Let me just shift to another point, if I may.
Can I just jump in very briefly?
Please, Marcela, by all means.
When you say there's a lot that can be done, but not all can be done, I think it's one of the challenges we face here, especially when we think about the different dimensions of sustainability. For example, in Brazil, we have a lot of hydroelectric power that's good for climate crisis, which is the focus of the discussion today. However, it comes with a huge biodiversity loss. So how, or for example, recycling, it's good for combating waste, but it also, depending on the material, it drains resources that are important, such as energy and water. So how do we decide which one we want to protect? And this is when I understand when authorities say they lack the mandate for that, because, for example, in Brazil, CADE cannot make this decision alone. You know what? And there's another problem with that we could have different parameters for what's acceptable in terms of sustainability and competition in different jurisdictions. For example, Europe wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's their goal right now. But Brazil, for example, could choose to focus on biodiversity. So we could have, companies could have a problem that is, they wouldn't have a one-size-fits-all solution when they're trying to go green. So on the other hand, okay, this is a argument for no, competition authorities shouldn't meddle with sustainability. On the other hand, we see, for example, CADE has cooperation agreements with several authorities, with several bodies in Brazil and abroad. I don't see why they couldn't do this with environmental bodies as well and try to decide together what makes sense. So that's just something that occurs to me when you talk about we can do something, maybe a lot, but not all.
Thank you, Marcela. I think this is very helpful as well, and especially this cooperation between competition authorities and environmental authorities in trying to at least understand the concerns of each other and how they can have interfaces. I think this has been neglected to a large extent in Brazil. And I think in other jurisdictions, maybe a bit less in Europe, but I think it's still, there's a ways to go in this dialogue between authorities and different regulators here. Let me turn to one additional point, and we're coming here to an end. We have another 10 minutes. So I'd like to come to one additional point and then look at questions again from the audience. The additional point is I participated earlier this year in the Competition Open Day at OECD, where the president of the French Competition Authority raised another concern on sustainability. He said, look, we've been discussing a lot cooperation among competitors and the impacts and how they could cooperate to actually help environmental policies, so on and so forth. But he was more concerned, or at least he said, that the French authority was turning its attention to a large extent to major changes in the structure of markets, right? Saying, look, what's happening, and if we take it seriously, the energy transition, some markets as we see them today are going to be completely different in 20 years. This has to do with innovation, as Pablo mentioned. I mean, if we're to tackle this issue on climate change, innovation is going to be a key driver. But it also has to do with industries that are already under profound change, right? Energy industries towards renewables, for instance, or as I mentioned, cars, manufacturers that are turning to electric vehicles, for instance. This can lead to more concentration in some industries and can sometimes potentially open for more competition, depending on where the innovations go, right? So I think that's one of the issues here. And then I thought there's a very interesting way of saying, look, we need to look more at this. What's going on with the structure of certain markets that are going to be profoundly changed in the next 20 years. But I also got out of this talk and this speech from the French authorities saying, look, how will this be factored in the discussions of the competition authorities? I mean, will they look at that when they're looking at new mergers? Will that factor in looking at conduct cases? I mean, I think that would be some of the question marks here. I mean, of course, these markets are changing, but how competition authorities should look at it, and how does this influence competition policy at all? Or if it doesn't, it's just a given. They just take it when it appears a new innovation. That's it. I mean, how do you see that? And any perspective that the panel would have on these changes?
I think the first, can I go, or does anybody? I think the first question we have here is related to which parameters are we considering. Are we going to have a gold standard that's applicable to all markets, or are we going to vary what's an admittable efficiency or an acceptable harm depending on the industry? Because we know that there are industries that have more impact on the environment than others. That's so are these industries going to be held to a higher standard, or are they going to be held to a lower standard because their activity is in itself more harmful? And it wouldn't be the role of competition authority to outlaw certain economic activities. And on the other hand, I think also that maybe I haven't seen this analyzed before, but when we were talking, the question came to me: is there a connection between high concentration or low concentration and environmental impact? Meaning, are industry more or less polluting because they are more concentrated, or when you have lower market shares and a lot of fringe players, do they become more polluting? For example, when you think about farming, I think this is maybe you have gains of scale with, for example, usage of water when you have a big farm. But if you have small farms in small towns, how does that? That's, I think, maybe something that could be studied. I haven't seen someone discussing this before, and I think it would greatly impact competition policy if we were able to reach a conclusion regarding this matter. So when I bring questions and no answers.
Thank you, Marcela. Any reactions, comments? Pablo?
May I?
Beth?
Oh,
Yes?
no, Pablo raised it first.
No, I think this is particularly important at the point we are now. We have been seeing regulation all across the globe, incentivizing certain environmental practices and going greener. And we also see some initiatives that create concerns about competition going forward. And some of them are protective measures based on sustainability concerns that might create significant dysfunctions in certain markets. And I think that this is also something that needs to be taken into account. And so we see initiatives relating to carbon tax or life cycle analysis or things of this sort, creating different parameters for local or international players, and other types of initiatives that I believe should be carefully reviewed and thought through in order to avoid dysfunctions to the market that will, at the end, injure consumers.
Elizabeth, do you want to
Okay.
go? Because I was like actually really curious what you have to say.
No, I think we have a very tricky discussion with many dimensions, and that putting face to face competition strategies for one side, but you also have this search for a sustainable or more sustainable environment for each one of the firms. Okay, they can design a strategy that will take advantage of this kind of certification and pricing to build a market, to have a price for products that are unpriced and bring biases. But okay, I would like to listen to you as well.
Yeah, so I thought like that's actually really an interesting question. How it's going to be looking in 20 years, and I think he's absolutely right to say there's going to be huge changes in the market, and I think it might make sense to go back to what we can learn from economics. And from economics, we can learn that in general, competition where people care about sustainability is good. So we should maintain competition where competition leads to more sustainability. Sustainable innovation is one classical example with that. But I think sustainable innovation gives us then directly the link back to innovation. And for innovation, we also know that too much and too little competition is both not particularly good. It's the inverted U shape. And I think in the same way, maybe we haven't seen the real studies, but I suspect we will see the studies telling us that having too little or too much competition will not be leading to sustainable outcomes, will not be good for the market. And I think the same will be happening there. And then where you are within the inverted U shape, more to the left or more to the right might be different in different markets. And I suppose markets with higher investment costs will be shifting more towards oligopolistic markets, and that's what the competition authorities will then also accept. Think about they have been rather accepting oligopolistic markets. If you think about mobile phones, right? The investments are so great that we are not surprised that we only have a handful of people that are offering mobile telecommunications. That's because the costs are so big. While in other areas, they have tried much more to sustain competition. I think that's what we will see most likely.
Yeah, that's interesting to see how these innovations can drive different market structures, and in different markets it could lead to very different outcomes. And I think that's quite interesting to hear as well, Julian. Well, we're getting to the end of our hour and a half, and we always try to keep it as close to the plan as possible. I'm looking at a few questions that we received, and I think we touched upon most of them. So we talked about consumer welfare, that was one question, intergeneration effects, another question. We also talked about differences in governance in a transnational way and how it can be impacted. So I think we touched upon many of these different interesting questions that we received, which I think is also a tribute to how interesting this panel was in general. So I'd really like to thank all the panelists, Julian, Pablo, Marcela, Elizabeth. It was truly a pleasure to discuss with you, to address some of the questions that we can already partially answer, but also to raise important questions that we can't answer yet probably, but that are important to be on the table and to lead to further reflection. So thank you very much for agreeing to participate in many different time zones and to this conversation here. And I hope to keep this conversation in other fora with all of you. Thank you very much. And with that, we can close here our broadcasting.
Thank you, Caio.
Thank you, Caio.
Great discussion.
Thank you, Caio, and everyone. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're still streaming, right?